If you replace your body and your memory piece by piece, at what point do you stop being you? And what makes you, you? That is the central question of Ghost in the Shell, which is based on this cyberpunk future where people replace their body parts with cybernetic parts.
The main character, Motoko, is almost entirely artificial, and the only human thing left in her is the ghost, her consciousness. And the setting of the story is this dense, layered, impossible city, which actually becomes an icon for the cyberpunk genre. And it's based on a real place, Hong Kong. Architects call it a city without ground, because you can walk for an hour through walkways and parks and malls and never touch the street. It was forced to grow vertically thanks to an extremely rare geographical and political condition, because mountains and harbor cover 3/4 of Hong Kong, leaving only the coastal strips buildable. And the little land there is all owned by the government and leased to a developer for a massive premium. So density, it's not really a choice. It was the only option. And the director, Mamoru Oshii, said Hong Kong had this energy he couldn't find anywhere else. And he came here specifically to study the architecture. But there's another reason. Hong Kong was never fully Chinese, never fully British, and it's always had this hybrid identity. And in 1995, when the film was released, that was just 2 years before the British handover to China. And nobody knew what was going to happen. So in a way, Hong Kong itself was the question. And in a parallel world, Hong Kong would have looked very different. Because before 1841, Hong Kong was this quiet coastline of fishing villages and salt farms, and it was just a small part of the Guangdong province in China. But around that time, millions of people all over China were becoming addicted to opium, which was being sold by British traders, and this was their way to fix their trade deficit with China. China tried to stop it by destroying a bunch of their opium stockpiles, and Britain's response was war. So that's the First Opium War, which China lost. And as payment, Britain took Hong Kong Island, then Kowloon, which came after the Second Opium War in 1860. But a few decades later, Britain realized that Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, they were kind of useless without this chunk of land right here, the new territories. So in 1898, Britain said, "Hey, China, we just want to lease some land off you. Don't worry, we're gonna give it back in 99 years until 1997. And in those 99 years, a lot of things happened.
These are Tong Lao, which literally translate into Chinese building. And in a way, they can tell you everything you need to know about what happened to Hong Kong over the next century. It's different from the Yong Lao, which are the Western style mansions that are built by the British. The Yong Lao were single family and single function, but the Tong Lao, they were the opposite. So you can have your shops on the ground floor and families above, and you could even have factories in there. So it's the Chinese way of building.
The British really just wanted a trade port, so the Chinese culture and language and their way of being, they mostly left alone. But under the British rule, that same building plugged into a trade network that reached the whole world. See, after World War II, millions of refugees poured in from mainland China, fleeing the Civil War, the Revolution, and poverty. Hong Kong was the natural escape because the border was still porous, and under the British protection, you could keep your lives and property safe from the Chinese government. Hong Kong's population doubled, and then it doubled again. Manufacturing also exploded. See, from day one, Hong Kong was declared a free port, meaning no tariffs on imports or exports. In 1947, there were 1,000 factories, but by 1967, there were 11,000, making anything from textiles to plastics to toys to electronics. You could find the label "Made in Hong Kong" on products all over the world. And a lot of that happened inside the Tong Lao. Imagine, at dawn, bolts of fabric gets wheeled in from the docks. Then it gets cut and stitched into shirts on the upper floors, or wigs, or toys, or plastic flowers, depending on the building. By nightfall, the finished goods are boxed up and shipped out to Macy's in New York or Marks and Spencer in London, anywhere there was demand. Workers would climb upstairs into their cots for bed, and by dawn, the trucks pulled up again. The whole life cycle of a product was compressed into one address. And under British law, a Chinese family could own that Tong Lao. They could pass it down, borrow against it, during a time when private property was being seized in mainland China. So the money moved here.
So these buildings were overcrowded and very poorly maintained, and people were getting exploited left and right. But what's weird is a lot of the locals look at it with a kind of nostalgia. And I guess it's because it captures the whole story of Hong Kong and the energy and optimism of that time. This is probably going to turn into something more like this. A lot of these Tong Lao are getting demolished today, and they're being redeveloped into residential towers. As you can see, they're pretty old, they're pretty dilapidated, and they're not really up to code. And the return per square foot is objectively much better with a 40-story building. But every time you demolish one, it kind of takes the memories with it too. This entire little neighborhood is full of Tong Lao, but as you can see here, most of the shell has been saved, but the interiors have been completely gutted. The original tenants have been evicted, and what we have now are these boutique shops. But well, that's not always the case. This is one of the few corner Tong Lao left in the city, built around 1926. There was a roast meat shop downstairs, and the family above, and a curing workshop on the roof. They kept the original handmade terrazzo signage, and also the bones of the building. But instead of turning it into a cafe, they gave it back to the neighborhood. The ground floor is a free community space. They host workshops and gatherings, and the people who actually live in the neighborhood come here. So they retained kind of the original social fabric of the building, not just the facade. But here's the catch. It was funded by a heritage foundation, so it was only possible by removing the pressure for profit from the equation. Tong Lao is one of the many artifacts that came from this very unusual context.
Hong Kong was handed over to China in 1997, but by that time, it had free press, an independent judiciary, and a surprisingly functional society. Canto pop, kung fu films, and cha-chan teng cafes were on every corner. And a whole way of being that didn't quite belong to anyone else. But I think the most interesting might be the more elusive parts. This quintessential Hong Kong value that I keep hearing about: efficiency and profit. The Tong Lao squeeze as much use as possible out of every square foot. The factories came because labor was cheap and turnaround was fast. The redevelopments are coming now because the land under the Tong Lao is worth more than anything the factories can produce now. And actually, I think everything about the city's architecture comes down to these two ideas: efficiency and profit, engineered to perfection.
I'm at the longest outdoor escalator system in the world. This is the famous Central Mid-Levels escalator. It's a chain of 20 escalators and 3 walkways, and it stretches 800 meters horizontally, climbing 135 meters in elevation. It was first built for commuters, but now there's about 55,000 riders per day, and this sheer amount of foot traffic accidentally created this area called Soho. There's lots of bars and restaurants here, and you could say it was driven by efficiency and profit. This is the MTR map. What I really like about these MTR stations is that every station has a distinct color. This one is blue.
The first line opened in 1979, and what's interesting is instead of building the city first and adding the train lines, Hong Kong built the trains and then let the city grow around them. And that's the result of a very clever system called the Rail Plus Property Model. The MTR Corporation doesn't just build the trains. They also develop the land around the stations. Revenue from the property funds the railway, and the railway raises property values. And it works. The MTR actually makes a profit just from ticket sales, and almost double what it costs to run the system. Most cities can't even cover half. So efficiency and profit. And this system, it created an entire urban form.
This is an example of what local architects call birthday cake development. Station at the base, shopping podium in the middle, and then a tower at the top.
Everything flows through the mall. So you buy more stuff, and the mall kind of becomes your de facto public square. There's actually a whole book about this, about how shopping malls have literally replaced the street as Hong Kong's primary public space. Efficiency and profit in the smallest possible footprint. And once you have hundreds of these birthday cakes next to each other, the whole city starts working in 3 dimensions. The fastest way to get around isn't always on the street anymore. Sometimes it's up an escalator. Sometimes it's across a footbridge. Sometimes it's through a mall. Hong Kong has over 1,500 footbridges, added over decades by different developers, until eventually they all connect into one continuous network. Here, I walked for about an hour from the Macau Ferry through Central and Admiralty all the way to Wan Chai without ever leaving the network. In fact, this Hong Kong guidebook is literally called Cities Without Ground, and it maps this insane 3-dimensional network. As an architect, I was very excited to experience this. A city that turned into this complex 3-dimensional network driven by a simple value system, efficiency, and profit. I think there's something very cool about that. But what I found, it was a little bit different from what I expected. By the way, all of the research and custom assets that we made for this video, you can check it out on our website, which we built using Framer, who's also the sponsor of this video. Framer is a no-code AI web builder that turns your ideas into a live website with a single click. And they just launched AI agents that work right on your live site. Hong Kong has a very distinct visual language, so we really wanted to tie it together with this abstraction of neon. But typically, changing a look like this for a whole website means editing every page by hand. But here, you prompt the agent once, and it updates the nav, and the colors, and the type, and pretty much everything. And because the models are much better now and more efficient, you can do the same work with fewer steps and fewer tokens. Everything the agent builds stays editable on the same canvas that you're designing in, which is how our team builds together with the agent in real time. This is what it looks like. And now you just click publish, and that's it. You can find our research page linked in the description with a Framer link and a discount code if you guys want to check it out.
These are all domestic workers that's gathered here on their Sundays off just to hang out. There's birthday parties and karaoke.
And I'm not gonna lie, I was a little bit surprised because it wasn't just on the footbridges, but under them, on the streets, and on the ground floor of the HSBC headquarters by Norman Foster, which is one of the most iconic buildings we all learned about in architecture school. It was kind of a groundbreaking structural innovation in the 80s, because the whole tower, it hangs from these huge steel masts, so there's no columns inside, which means the entire ground floor could be left open as a covered public space.
Game begin.
A 3-dimensional network. It sounds cool on paper, but the ground is not just how you get around, but it's also where public life happens. So you hang out, you can meet up without buying anything, because the street on the ground is a public space. But a street that's weaving in and out of malls, well, somebody spent money building that. So most of this network is privately owned, attached to malls or offices, meaning there are a bunch of things that you're not allowed to do. And at some point, you are strongly encouraged to buy something. So Hong Kong has a real scarcity of real public spaces, but also a huge scarcity of private space. There's about 350,000 foreign domestic workers in Hong Kong, mostly from the Philippines and Indonesia. And by law, they have to live in their employers' homes. So when they have their days off on Sundays, they can't really hang out in their homes. And because they get a very low salary, it's not really feasible for them to hang out at a cafe where they have to keep buying stuff. And of course, there are parks, but not really enough of them, and it can rain. And in the summer, Hong Kong is very hot, and just like a full open space is not really feasible. I was pretty surprised, because before coming to Hong Kong, I'd read a lot about the beauty of this efficient system and this three-dimensional network. But I think that's actually a problem of looking at cities from the top down as an architect, because you see the system and the diagrams and the efficiency and the cleverness of it, and it's beautiful, but reality is always a little bit more nuanced than that. But again, it's not all black and white, because there are some genuinely very cool things that come out of the city.
This is Choi Hung Estate. You might have seen it on Instagram. It's one of Hong Kong's oldest and probably most iconic housing developments, built in 1962. There's 11 apartment blocks and roughly 7,400 units, and about 17,500 people live here. But it really doesn't feel that dense when you walk around, because as you can see, the buildings have been intentionally staggered in height to reduce that feeling of density. And within this, there's a shopping center, a school, and a wet market. So it's really a mini city.
It actually has that Tong Lao spirit, with shops on the ground and life above.
And it's created a very tight-knit community of people, with people who's lived in the same block for more than 50 years. And I think it's the kind of place where the shopkeepers know each family by name.
It actually won the Hong Kong Institute of Architects Silver Medal in 1965. But starting in 2028, Choi Hung is coming down. The buildings are old, so they'll build a newer, taller, denser version of the same idea, adding 1,800 new units to the housing stock, which is a lot. Because Hong Kong does have the most expensive housing in the world, and the wait time for public housing is almost 5 years. The whole thing happens over 3 phases, over 20 years. The first group moves out to another estate, and their block comes down. Then the new towers go up, and then the second group moves into those towers, while their old block gets demolished. And the last group does the exact same thing. So it rebuilds itself piece by piece. And on paper, it's actually a very smart system. But in reality, you're living in a constant construction site for 20 years, and almost a third of the people are over 65. You'll be over 85 years old by the time it's done, and you slowly lose the community that you've lived with your whole life. Because the community, it's not just about the people, it's about the arrangement.
Imagine I'm 70 years old, and then you tell me that I will be relocated 15 years later. So what do I do now? Should I wait or not? They love those buildings. They love the community.
This is Don. He's one of the people trying to save Choi Hung. Not exactly as they are, but just an alternative.
We cannot be too naive to say that we have to preserve all the buildings without proposing how do we reuse the buildings, because we understand that a lot of buildings that is not in a really great structural conditions, because what we're trying to do is to find the middle ground between total demolition and total preservations.
So their proposal is to keep some of the important blocks, or adding on top of them, or preserving the facades, or the staggered heights, the rooftop spaces, and the retail arcade. And of course, the community spirit.
We don't want to preserve the concrete itself. We want to preserve the memory, but also bring this kind of memory to the future.
The thing with preservation is that the argument for preservation is usually pretty soft. Things like aesthetic value or community or heritage. It really doesn't have a direct impact on the spreadsheet, like units or value per square foot.
Hong Kong does have a heritage system, but there's no legislation protected for all the listed buildings, which means that the owner of the heritage could lock down the buildings without any penalties. They have perfect legal right to do it.
Fewer than 150 buildings in the entire city are actually protected by law. But all over the world, we are actually starting to save and retrofit these modernist blocks. Because two arguments for preservation have entered the equation: embodied carbon and construction cost. This is a 16-story public housing tower in Paris, built in 1961, and it was scheduled for demolition in 2000, but instead, it was transformed. It's actually done by one of my favorite architects, Vassal, and they wrap the existing concrete structure in a new 3-meter skin of winter gardens. Every apartment got 25 to 30% bigger, and the tenants, they didn't have to leave. New units were created or subdivided, so the existing tenants were just moved around the building as soon as the units became ready. And here's the big part. The whole project cost half of what demolition and rebuild would have cost. But this kind of process takes more time. And these arguments, the heritage, the carbon, the social fabric, they only count if there's a legal framework to make them count. Otherwise, the same forces that built Choi Hung are the exact same forces that take it down. And I think that's kind of sad.
We are not kind of educated to know how to express what we wanted in kind of community, because we are always educated about we have to fulfill the numbers, we have to have some places to live. But we are not educated about we kind of want the belonging of the community. We already regret about taking all down the Tong Lao. 20 years later, they will talk about the same topic we're having right now, because we are not having much left. The history just repeats again and again.
Probably the thing that made Hong Kong, and the thing that really cemented it in our minds is the neon, because it's the atmosphere, but it's also businesses fighting for attention 3-dimensionally on a cramped street.
Efficiency and profit. But it's also a craft. When you start a business, you commission it to a master sign maker when you open the shop, who bends the glass tubes over a flame and blows it into shape. Different gases lead to different colors. Neon for red, argon and mercury for blue, helium for pink, and krypton for white. And when you apply an electric charge, the gas glows. The whole thing's kind of magical. And the sign gets passed down to your kids and your grandkids, because the sign becomes the shop. But it's also the atmosphere of Hong Kong. Reds and greens dripping onto wet pavement. That lonely intimacy of fallen angels. It's the Hong Kong that Mamoru Oshii fell in love with when he made Ghost in the Shell, and the backdrop of hundreds of other films produced in Hong Kong at the time.
This street actually used to be full of neon, but as you can see, there's only a few left. They're old and they're poorly maintained, and they're a structural risk, especially during typhoons. So the city put in restrictions that say you can either remove them or get it structurally certified by an engineer and replace them with LED signs flush against the wall. But it's extremely expensive, and to get it certified and permitted, it's about 15,000 Hong Kong dollars. So most shops can't afford them. In fact, most shops have actually closed down. And some people, they do replace it, but it pales in comparison to what it was before.
LED, they replace the whole sign industry. They're more cost effective, more cheaper. Shop owner, they're picking the new technology.
There is a nonprofit called the Tetra Neon Exchange that rescues the signs and restores them and archives them in a safe space or in a museum. And there's artists like Jive, who learned the craft and now uses the same process to make signs and art pieces. But these streets, full of neon, well, that's a little harder to see. So in Ghost in the Shell, Motoko, she replaces her arms and her eyes and even her memory. And all of this is to upgrade herself and make herself faster and stronger and more efficient. And the only thing it can't account for is the part that makes her her, the ghost. Because keeping that ghost, it would actually mean she would be a less efficient cyborg. So in a system built to optimize, the ghost is actually the first thing to go. I'm gonna be honest, I came to Hong Kong expecting a slightly different story about political pressure and an identity crisis and something that's being taken away from the people. But after talking to the people here, they all seem to say one thing: it's money. The biggest driver in all this change is efficiency and profit. The same engine that created Hong Kong, but now it's running at 100 times the speed, where every square inch has to justify itself. So things like memory and texture, the identity, things that don't directly add value on a spreadsheet, it's hard to make an argument for. And actually, you do see this happening all over the world. Because why should you preserve an old, dilapidated building when you can have something that's way newer and more profitable and more efficient and that can house more people? When you look at the pure math of it, the answer is very obvious. Especially when it comes to things like cheap neon or the concrete housing blocks. They're utilitarian and working class. It's just background. It's not monumental, it's not designed by a famous architect, so it's not worth preserving. But sometimes that background is the identity. A lot of these are getting preserved, but in museums. And that is great, but photos and films, they just let you see our history. But only architecture lets you experience it. And that's a very unique gift that only architecture can give. And if we look back 100 or 1,000 years from now, I wonder if we're gonna regret tearing these buildings down. Because with every building that comes down, we lose a memory. And without the memories, the city is just a shell. So this idea of losing the ghost of a city, and what even is a ghost, that has been kind of the single thread through all of the somewhat random things we've talked about on this channel. It's really about using architecture to understand what it means to be human. And for the last few years, I've met people who have really inspired me. And a lot of them are people who have spent decades slowly and painfully learning a single craft, which is kind of a contradiction in this age of efficiency and profit. But that's also exactly why I wanted to work with them to try to turn this very abstract idea into something more tangible, into something you can hold. And I'll leave it at that. I'm gonna tell you the whole story in our newsletter, and the first newsletter comes out this month. So I'm gonna leave the link in the description, so make sure you go and sign up. And with that, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.